having U.S. presence in Ukraine is critical, because that's the way you most clearly convince Putin that we're ready to fight. And that's what deterrence is all about. That's why ground force presence is important.
Donald Trump has admitted Vladimir Putin may not want a peace deal with Ukraine. The US president also reiterated that he would not send any American troops to Ukraine as part of an agreement. He's been speaking to Fox News in the last few hours.
When it comes to security, they're willing to put people on the ground. We're willing to help them with things, especially probably if you talk about by air, because nobody has the kind of stuff we have. Really, they don't have. But I don't think it's going to be a problem. I think if a deal is made, famous last words, right? But I think if a deal is made, I think Russia's had it. They've all had it. And for a very extended period of time, I don't think there'll be a problem. But there'll be some form of security. It can't be NATO, because that's just not something that would ever happen. They couldn't do that. So who would want that? I mean, if you were Russia, who would want to have your enemy, your opponent, sitting on your line? You don't do that.
Donald Trump there speaking a few hours ago. It comes after European leaders met with Trump in Washington last night, many of whom pushed the US president for a ceasefire. Here's Keir Starmer speaking on a video posted on X earlier.
Both of the outcomes that we, the United Kingdom, most wanted, we've moved forward in a material way. A breakthrough when it comes to security guarantees. These guarantees will ensure that if there is a peace, if there is a deal, then we hold to it and there isn't further conflict. So really important for Ukraine, really important for Europe, and really important for the United Kingdom as well. The second is that there will now be a bilateral meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky after a phone call by President Trump during the course of this afternoon to President Putin.
Keir Starmer there speaking a little earlier. Let's speak to Ian Brzezinski then, who's a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO policy under George W. Bush. Ian, good evening to you.
Good evening, Kate. Thanks for having me on.
Several different angles for us here to cover as we look at how discussions have moved on apace since the White House last night. Donald Trump confirming last night that the US would be involved in security guarantees for Ukraine, but today confirming that would not be boots on the ground. What do you make of that?
Well, it's good news that the president is now actively considering some sort of US role in a security guarantee that will be provided to Ukraine. And it's a fair request that he's making, that the Europeans carry the heavy burden of this guarantee force, this deterrent force that would go into Ukraine. In order for that force to have credibility, it's going to have a ground component in Ukraine. And I would argue in order for it to have credibility, it's going to have a U.S. ground component in Ukraine. The reason being is that if the Europeans are there alone, I think it's very likely that Putin will test that deterrent force, believing the United States isn't fully committed to fight the Russians in the event of a violation of that ceasefire. And the reason for that is because for 3 administrations now, the United States has said no boots on the ground, essentially asserting that we don't have enough vital interests in Ukraine to justify that. Now that Trump is perhaps shifting in a direction to add a U.S. dimension to deterrent, it's going to be even more challenging because of that history to make that deterrent force credible in the eyes of Putin.
I mean, look, does it matter if the US, and I'll sort of come back on your question here, really. I was talking to a guest last night about how the US actually often don't hold their security guarantees anyway. And the other side to that is Russia often don't respect any amount of security guarantee given to Ukraine. It won't necessarily stop Russia anyway. So when we boil this down, does it sort of come down to semantics? Does the absence of US boots on the ground really mean that much if they're going to look at perhaps things like air cover or sea cover, and that's how they support Ukrainian security guarantees?
You know, if you had a situation in which the Europeans had ground forces, maybe air defense forces too, even some offensive strike forces on the ground in Ukraine, but the United States was sitting back in Poland or in Germany with its air forces, Putin might conclude that the United States doesn't have the political will to actually defend the Europeans. because over the last 3 administrations, we've articulated pretty clearly, I think wrongly, incorrectly so, but we communicated that we don't have the vital interests at stake in this war. That's why, in order to have maximum deterrent effect, having U.S. presence in Ukraine is critical, because that's the way you most clearly convince Putin that we're ready to fight. And that's what deterrence is all about. That's why ground force presence is important. Doesn't have to be huge, doesn't have to be the predominant force, but it has to be there to give the Europeans that quote-unquote extra spine in the eyes of Putin.
We know that Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron hosted a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing Nations, and there were several there, around 30 or so. There are discussions going on and more detailed meetings set to take place later today and tomorrow with military leaders looking at how that ground deterrent might look. And I wonder, from your experience, we'll take out the fact that you think that the US should be there and you think it's weak that they're not. What should European nations be discussing? What is absolutely tantamount in importance to have as this deterrent, to utterly make sure that Vladimir Putin never gets a chance to go back and have another go?
It's going to be the operational capability on the ground that's going to shape Putin's perceptions. I'm a little bit worried that some of the figures that have been talked about, 20,000, 15,000 forces, which is really more an observation force, that's not going to cut it. This is going to have to be 2 to 3 divisions, something about 60,000 personnel, with real offensive strike capability, robust air cover, including air forces in addition to air defense elements, a capability that could punch a hole in Russian lines that would enable the Ukrainians to basically jeopardize Putin's gains. That's the only way you have a credible deterrent. Less than that, I think Putin is going to test, especially if there isn't an American ground element to it.
Okay, interesting. All right. Let's look at Russia if we can, because I was looking at the comments a little earlier on of the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who appears to be, well, you tell me what you think, when he talked about any summit. This is the trilateral that's been proposed by Donald Trump, agreed to by Volodymyr Zelensky, and we understand that Vladimir Putin is sympathetic to this, that he's leaning in the direction of this. But Lavrov saying today any summit would have to be prepared step by step, gradually, starting from the expert level and then going through all the necessary stages. Is this more from Russia of, yes, we agree in principle, but in practice, we're going to delay this, we're going to knock this down the line as long as we can?
Lavrov and Putin are continuing to string Trump and the Transatlantic Committee along and Ukraine along. What he's doing is exactly what you said. He's trying to buy time to allow the Russian offensive to continue, hoping that there could be a major breakthrough that would enable the Russians to not only attain more territory, but increase their leverage in the negotiations. So this is a stalling tactic. And this was one of the mistakes that Trump made in Alaska. He conceded the demand, he gave up the demand for an immediate ceasefire. What he should do is demand an immediate ceasefire, and if the Russians don't comply, they should then impose maximum sanctions. And when we don't do that, we're actually undermining the credibility of the transatlantic negotiating posture. So the time for severe sanctions are important, because that's how you force Putin to the table, that's how you force a ceasefire, and ultimately, that's how you add credibility to the deterrent force that's going to have to be part of the end game.
Look, Ian, really good to speak to you. Thank you. We will leave it there for time, but some wise counsel, as ever, from you. Ian Brzezinski there, who is a former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO policy under George W. Bush. Thank you for being with us.